Sonic Frontiers is a game that I was certain I was going to hate. A game that I thought was going to turn out to be a train wreck. And can you really blame me? 5 years of near radio silence after the travesty of Sonic Forces, and the very few games that actually came out during this time happened to all end up being travesties as well. TSR with its lack of content, poorly mishandled online, and general downgrade from Transformed. Sonic Colors Ultimate with its seizure glitches and lack of any quality control. And Sonic Origins with its anti-consumer practices and cut corners. I had lost a lot of faith in the Sonic game franchise over this past decade as a whole, and come Sonic Frontiers with its actual announcements and trailers, well, that did nothing but further fuel my hatred for this blue rat. The open world Breath of the Wild direction did not seem fitting for the Sonic franchise at all, and combining that with controls and physics looking as if they were stripped right out of Forces, awful looking cyberspace levels, and beyond everything else, a general lack of polish plaguing everything I saw, I couldn't say I was particularly confident that this game would turn out great. Unlike a lot of other people, I found myself becoming more and more concerned with the game the more and more that was shown off, and by release I went into the game certain that I was going to hate it as I said, but I bought it anyway. Unfortunately, I can't say my concerns were alleviated at first. While playing Kronos Islands, most of my expected issues had come to manifest. Haphazardly designed open world, janky combat and mini-bosses, boring and easy puzzles to destroy the pacing of the game, and I felt that the earlier Cyberspace levels were some of the worst boost levels I had ever played in the series. But then something shifted my perception of this game. Something pulled a complete 180 on me, and that was the first Titan boss against Giganto. I'll just say that this was a unimaginably hype moment. Playing as Super Sonic against a massive Shadow of the Colossus-esque boss, utilizing all the mechanics the game had taught you up until that point, such as the parrying system and various combat skills, and this all paired with the track Undefeatable, which is probably my favourite song in the game, led to this boss fight changing my whole prior perspective of the game, and that was really only the beginning. From that point onwards, I found even a lot of other elements and issues I had to be addressed. And even with the inconsistent quality of the game, I ended up really enjoying myself with what it had on offer, and well, Sonic Frontiers ended up defying my expectations and offered easily the best 3D Sonic game since Generations, which is not a high bar to pass. Is this game really that great though? Was it really worth the 5 years of suffering and torture? Not really, to be honest, which is what this video is about, I guess. I do like the open nature of this game, in theory. I find it very refreshing after years of very linear and restrictive Sonic titles. It brings me back to the adventure games even, such as how rewarding it is to abuse the mechanics and skip through intended level design. That said, I can't say I'm a huge fan of the open zone here at all. I know people love it, but it is easily my least favorite part of this game, and I would hate to see Sonic Team continue games in this style unless it were heavily revamped. I would have much rather had a more traditional and linearly structured Sonic game, to be honest, and that's why the cyberspace levels click with me more than others. I find that a lot of people say the cyberspace levels in this game are the worst part about it, but I cannot agree with that at all. Yeah, okay, don't get me wrong, there are some pretty bad things about them. The controls feel like arse. This applies to the whole game, to be honest, but they're especially bad in cyberspace. Forces does control better than this game, to be honest. Your momentum is completely lost after jumping and there's no short hop either. The homing attack feels very sluggish, the boost feels extremely underpowered, you can't double up the moves in the air such as stomping or boosting, and just generally speaking, the handling of Sonic feels very off. Additionally, the reuse of tired old zones, Green Hill, Chemical Plant, Sky Sanctuary, it's absolutely insulting. I cannot comprehend why they had to do this again. I would have much rather had Gameland type levels or even just more generic and broad level themes, like with the city levels. Regardless, ignoring that, the cyberspace levels here have surprisingly great level design. They aren't the same quality of Gens Unleashed, but I would argue they're of much higher quality than Forces, and even Colors. Okay, so a lot of the levels are just reskin levels from older games like Adventure 2 Unleashed and Gens, but I mean, I have to be honest, a lot of these levels are just flat out good and fun to play through. Yeah, while playing these, I'm thinking to myself I'd rather just play through the original games, but I'm also thinking to myself, the level design is still fun, regardless, and I'm having a much better time playing these unoriginal levels than I am messing around grinding collectibles in an overworld, and I'm sorry, but I can't help but love the SA2 levels because it's an interesting twist, it's a completely different gameplay formula. All in all, there is still a good chunk of completely original levels here anyway, and a lot of these levels are pretty well designed. They're all pretty extensive and open-ended in design, with branching pathways and fun platforming, plus a healthy amount of 3D, which I cannot say about Forces or Colors. And really, this game ended up scratching an itch I had for boost Sonic gameplay that Forces was completely unable to reach. That said, the cyberspace levels in this game, while fun, are definitely dragged down by the focus on the open world, and had they been the priority, I think I would have liked this game a lot more. Say the cyberspace levels had been twice as long with original level themes, for instance. Overall, I wish the open worlds acted more like SA1 hub worlds, to the main content being the standard boost levels, than the other way around where the cyberspace levels feel tacked on. Instead, the vast majority of this game is spent within the open zone, which is something I don't take much pleasure in. It's super unpolished as a whole, with very janky physics and animations, subpar visuals at times, and egregious pop-in. The main issue I have with the open zone, however, is the extremely formulaic gameplay loop. It leads to this game being super repetitive and monotonous. To be honest, I didn't hate the gameplay loop for the entirety of the game. The middle point at around Ares and Chaos Island I think was the peak of the game, and while repetitive I found it fun to go through the motions nonetheless. The gears obtained through the mini-boss fights can be rewarding to obtain. The combat ended up being a lot more enjoyable than I expected, especially with all the skills unlocked later on, and can lead to a lot of combat sequences, especially the bosses, to be super flashy and satisfying. It is flawed, such as how the parry system is brain dead mindless. Overall, I found the combat in the game to be too easy, especially later on. Maybe it's having a borderline infinite number of rings with the side loop, or just feeling overpowered in general. Either way, I wish I could have been tested more with the combat, and I was playing on hard mode. But even so, a lot of the mini-bosses and the way to obtain gears can be honestly awesome at points, with great set pieces, creative ideas, and the flashy combat on top. Some of the platforming challenges scattered throughout the overworld can be fun to engage with too. The memory fragments you're forced to collect can get a little overbearing, especially by the final world, but it is satisfying to boost through and collect them within the world at times. I feel like the level design in the overworld shines with some of the Chaos Emerald sequences though. The platforming you're required to go through to obtain a number of them are just as complex as the cyberspace levels are. Also, I know people hate the 4th island, but it is a shorter, inoffensive, story-based island. I had a great time with it. The 6 towers you're required to climb can be pretty challenging and fun, and in the context of the story, rewarding to get lore dumps at the top. But yeah, overall, the gameplay loop of grabbing gears from bosses, grabbing keys from cyberspace levels, grabbing Chaos Emeralds after platforming sequences, and then eventually the Titan boss fights, it's repetitive, but I found it to be enjoyable. Earlier on, at least. Not the final island, because by that point it becomes a chore. The main progression gating that I'm not a huge fan of are the memory tokens, because they're used to lock out cutscenes that you're required to go through to continue the game, and at times it can get very grindy. On repeat playthroughs, I feel like it will be a little bit tedious to play through the game in entirety, honestly, because a major force pushing me through the game was the story, which I have to say was a massive highlight for me. Unsurprisingly though, because it was written by Ian Flynn, but the story here is a massive, and I mean massive, upgrade to anything the series has put out since Sonic Unleashed. And while I still prefer the adventure stories, what here is actually great for Sonic standards. I love the shift to a more serious and genuine tone. Everything isn't said for shits and giggles anymore. A lot of the voice acting has a deeper, more grounded tone, which I was a little taken aback from at first, but definitely grew on me. The characterization was great. I love the exploration of especially Tails and Knuckles and their backstory, not to mention the introduction of Sage and her relationship with Eggman. Something, however, I loved about this game is that I feel like it's the first time since 06, or arguably the Rush/Rivals games, that I feel like this game was actually pushing forward the entire series narrative. Pushing forward a story that hadn't been pushed in so long. Every game from Unleashed onwards feels very self-contained in its storytelling, but this game introduces some world building and lore, such as adding backstory to the Chaos Emeralds and the Chaos species in general. Not just that, but as I said before, it has quite a good chunk of character development, notably how it explores Tails and his cowardice and self-esteem in previously written games like Forces. It constantly references older games and events too, which does help to add depth to the world, characters, and writing in general. It's pretty gratifying to understand everything as a long-term fan, I'd have to say. I think this is the first time in a long time that I'm now looking forward to what the series has to offer, primarily for story reasons. To see more Sonic characters like Shadow and Rouge written in the same quality that we have here, to have more world building and ideas expanded upon. I know I shouldn't, but I can't help but be excited for the future of the series. So really what I'm getting at is that the quality in the writing and story presented here was enough motivation for me to actually want to engage with this game's core gameplay loop of grinding memory tokens, because I wanted to find out what happened next. But as with what I've been alluding to, the ending of this game was where I felt like everything just started to fall apart at the seams. This game started to notably go downhill by Chaos Island even, and while I was still enjoying myself with the game by that point, it still offered completely brand new island, new bosses, mechanics, etc. The design started to degrade in quality, specifically with a lot of forced 2D segments. But it was the final island in particular where I found this game to be at its absolute worst. Uranus Island being the same environment as Kronos is the obvious thing to point at. It really does go to show how rushed this game ended up being when they started to cut up content like this. Honestly, I feel like this game's pacing and quality overall would have been much better if they just stuck to 3 islands as originally planned. But the final version of this game, everything in this island acts to just unnecessarily pad out this game. I felt as if this island failed to evolve or innovate on any of the previous ideas this game established, and that's even ignoring the reuse of the same grassy location. The boss and enemy types were all derivative of previous ones. The platforming challenges were all more or less the same thing we've seen a billion times previously. The cyberspace levels blended in with all the previous ones and previous islands. But the worst kicker is the grind for memory tokens. This is where the game just felt the most repetitive and grindy. By this point, whatever fun I was having had been completely sapped out when the game requires something ridiculous like 200 tokens to progress. The story takes a massive backseat too, which feels extremely off, as the previous island felt as if it was leading up to a massive payoff or something. Sage, for nearly the entire game, was building up the idea of Sonic and Eggman working together to save the day, but instead Eggman just vanishes for the entire story and has very little involvement whatsoever. Something else that was built up through the whole game was these massive expectations of an over-the-top final boss. The previous bosses all incorporated Super Sonic, which had only previously been delegated to final bosses. And on top of that, Sage was consistently remarking how impossible the odds were in your favor, how little chance of success Eggman and Sonic had, how impossibly powerful the final boss was. I was going into this final boss expecting the peak of the game, but it was instead the exact opposite. The final Titan boss Supreme just felt like the same boss fight we had already gone through at least 2 previous times. The allure and excitement of the fight against Giganto had completely dissipated by this point of the game because I feel like these bosses just started to blend together. Not just that, but became substantially easier as well. Supreme was pretty easy to defeat and would have only taken a minute or so if the fight wasn't half scripted. And this was followed up by one of the weirdest Sonic endings of all time. I can't think of anything weirder, honestly. Instead of some epic space supersonic boss fight a la Sonic Adventure 2, which is what I was expecting, this game turns into Ikaruga against a moon. The story I felt really didn't go anywhere, the expectations built up never had a payoff, and I kinda just left this game confused to what I had experienced. Not to mention Amy blurting out sticks. What are the lore implications surrounding this? I need to know. It's pretty disappointing that the game had to end off on such a sour note for me, because I really do feel like, as flawed as it was, this game had something great going for itself, but it never realized that potential. Sonic Frontiers is a game in a vacuum I think was pretty good. The Sonic series has always been widely inconsistent, even the best of the best 3D games are still pretty flawed. Frontiers, while not my favourite Sonic game, is far from my least favourite. I would say it's more or less average, not by a mean but by a median. There is an equal number of 3D Sonic games I prefer to this game than there are games I prefer this game to, and that's not a bad thing at all. I still love even the most shit Sonic games, and this is really above average as a whole. I had a relatively great time here. As I said, it exceeded my expectations, it provided a story of quality we haven't seen in years, and scratched an itch I had for a Boo Sonic title that hadn't been scratched in what seemed like eons. That said, once you start to unveil the curtains surrounding this game and look at the context of the series as a whole, I can't be as positive. I know development time doesn't necessarily correlate with quality. You can spend a year or so and come out with Majora's Mask, or 15 for Duke Nukem Forever, but 5 years is still a long time nonetheless. In that time, masterpieces, quote unquote, like Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring were developed. I feel like there is a distinction to be made here, and it's that if you dedicate this much development time to a game, especially a flagship title, and it doesn't turn out fantastically, well, there definitely has to be something going severely wrong internally. Whether that be poor management, okay, yeah, it's definitely poor management, let's be real. Sonic Frontiers turned out fine, but that's it. The game's rushed, it feels very unpolished and budget as a whole. Content feels weirdly paced and cut and pasted, there are graphical and gameplay oddities that haven't been ironed out. This doesn't feel like a game that had 5 years of development. Had this game come out in 2017 instead of Forces right off the heels of Mania, I would have loved it, flaws and all. The series was in such a dire situation at that point, and having a game of this quality reassure me that the series was in somewhat alright hands, I would have been a lot more content and willing to wait 5 years for another sequel. Instead, off the heels of Forces, waiting 5 years for a game that still feels experimental, still feels undercooked, it's where I kinda have to draw the line. It's just crazy to think that Sonic Team ditched a winning formula after generations. I know they tried to bring it back and failed with Forces, but surely I'm not crazy for thinking it would have been a much, much, much better course of action to spend that 5 years and looking into exactly what made the most beloved Sonic games the way they were and developing upon those ideas and making something even better, rather than looking into inspiration from Breath of the Wild of all things and trying to cram in Sonic mechanics and physics. I don't know, it's just not the way I'd go with this series. Looking back at the Renaissance era, or especially how Sega never commissioned a Sonic Mania sequel, I can't help but be concerned that even had Frontiers been a masterpiece, what gives me the confidence that Sega and Sonic Team will follow through and make the next Sonic game another 5 years from now even good? The Sonic series has been far too inconsistent for me to be confident about the state of it. If anything, amid the myriad of terrible and poorly handled releases over these past 5 years, I think Frontiers was a miracle that it even turned out the way it did. Sonic Frontiers may be a good game, but even so, I'm not going to gain a full sense of trust that the series is or will ever be in good hands until they can prove so. Until Sonic Team can prove that they can consistently make good games, because otherwise this could always be a fluke. This past decade has been easily the worst for the Sonic franchise, and one good game isn't going to somehow fix that. Anyway, before this video ends, I completely forgot to mention this. The worst part of this game is actually the soundtrack. It's easily the worst mainline Sonic OST. Okay, goodbye.